remember the race riot and how mean people were during the race riot and the relationship between white and black at that time. And I wondered how people could be so mean.
For some white people, a black person with any wealth, then as well as today, is something that created jealousy.
The KKK had an enormous presence in Oklahoma and in Tulsa particularly.
I will always remember 4 men coming in our house with torches, and my mother saw them coming, and she put the 4 of we children under the bed. And from under the bed, we could see them walking to the curtains and setting fire to the curtains to set our house on fire.
May 31st, Tulsa, Oklahoma. A spark of racial violence that would forever change the path of a once prosperous black neighborhood. On this fateful day, years of progress would be stifled. For this was the day that a white mob launched an invasion upon the homes and businesses of black Tulsans, burning and killing until nothing was left of what used to be known as Negro Wall Street. But how did the riot begin, and what happened afterwards? Tulsa was a segregated city. The blacks lived in the northern neighborhood of Greenwood, while the whites had the rest of the city. Racial tensions were high, and the whites in the city were jealous of the success of the wealthy blacks of Greenwood. On May 31st, a young black boy named Dick Rowland was falsely accused of sexually assaulting a white girl. The white Tulsans wanted to lynch him as punishment. The blacks did not want this to happen, and attempted to defend the boy. What followed was an armed conflict that ended with the whites and city police collaborating to kill and imprison any blacks within the city. Once all the blacks were imprisoned, the whites went building to building and burned down all of Greenwood. 300 blacks were killed. Even women and children were not safe from the racially fueled massacre.
When we rode through Greenwood, I said we will never, 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 ever come back here. Thought we would never, ever come back. There was not a building standing.
The economy of Tulsa began to come to a grinding halt because all these black men who were doing these so-called menial jobs were absent.
Although the riot was over, the blacks of Tulsa still faced another problem. Most of them were still imprisoned in internment camps and were only freed because of the economic repercussions.
Faced with economic loss, white employers arranged for the release of the African Americans from the detention centers. But to gain their freedom, African Americans must wear specially issued tags signed by their employers.
The blacks had lost their homes, businesses, and livelihoods. They had nothing left, and they were still imprisoned and treated like they were nothing. This behavior was only the start of a long process of suppression that followed the Tulsa race riot. Once the blacks were finally released from the prison camps, they began the long and strenuous process of rebuilding their city. Many blacks left the area completely, but those who remained behind were determined to rebuild. The Red Cross set up tents and provided aid and shelter in the months following the riot. Though the blacks of Tulsa were ready to rebuild, authority figures in Tulsa were not so keen to start the rebuilding process. A reconstruction committee was formed by the city officials, but they had no true intention of actually helping rebuild. A consequent effect of the riot is that the city now had a perfect excuse to take all the land for themselves and use it for industrial purposes. In order to slow down the blacks' rebuilding process, the city enacted strict new building codes that were near impossible to satisfy. All of this was in an effort to stop the blacks from rebuilding. But they would not sit idly by and allow themselves to be suppressed once more. Tulsa-based lawyer B.C. Franklin, who had lost his law office in the riot, mounted a legal attack upon the new building regulations. Him and his associates worked out of a tent and were successfully able to force the city to repeal the unfair building regulations. In the weeks after the riot, a grand jury was formed to charge those who had participated in the event. The jury found that the blacks were to blame for the riot, and no whites ever went to trial for their actions within the riot. Meanwhile, the black community was busy. They would rebuild their neighborhood without any help from the city government. It was a long, hard process, but eventually Greenwood was rebuilt, and in the 1930s, they were once again able to reach the level of prosperity they had before the riot. But Greenwood's resurgence was only temporary. Once Tulsa was desegregated in the 1950s, blacks were able to spread out through the city, and they were no longer forced to remain only in the neighborhood of Greenwood. Eventually, the once thriving businesses began to close their doors. Finally, in the 1960s, the federal government purchased and demolished most of Greenwood, using the land for a newly built interstate. The Tulsa race riot was a direct cause of unprecedented hatred and racism. A thriving city of successful, hardworking people was reduced to nothing over false accusations and dangerous mob mentality. The direct effects of the riot crippled the city economically and caused Tulsa to lose a large portion of its black population. It serves as a dire reminder that even in times of great prosperity, the prejudice of man can change the course of history. But what happened in Tulsa was not about the loss, it was about the redemption. The impossible was done, a whole city reconstructed without any help from the government. The people of Greenwood were able to come together in the face of contempt and flourish once more.